are our closest companions, our best friends, the ever-present source of comfort? Why, books, of course. I'm sure many of you, like me, found that it was reading that kept us going. It was reading that kept our minds alert and sane, and it was reading that gave us hope for a brighter day. Wisdom and sanity are really the need of the hour. Because literature really encompasses every aspect of human thought and endeavor. So really, we are a festival of ideas.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Tata Literature Live 2021, the 12th Annual Mumbai International Literature Fest. The festival is co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects and powered by Godrej. As you must be aware, it has been an extremely difficult year for the festival, having lost two of our stalwarts, our founder and festival director Anil Dharker and our executive director Hrishi. This year's edition is a testament to the monument they created and a tribute to their legacy. As you must have seen in our opening film, this session is in honor of our founder and guiding light, Anil Dharker. And so, henceforth, the first session of every edition of Tata Literature Live will always be known as For the Love of the Word, the Anil Dharker session. I would now like to invite the director of Tata Literature Live 2021, Amy Fernandez, to say a few words.
Good evening everyone and welcome to the 12th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest. I am here today with mixed feelings, one of a deep sense of loss at the passing of our beloved founder and festival director Anil Dharker and our executive director Hrishi. But I am also here with a deep sense of gratitude that the Literature Live team shares with me at being able to carry forward in a small way the legacy they have left behind. This year has forced us to continue with the digital version. Now, forced is a wrong word to use. It has actually helped us realize the widespan reach of the digital media. Last year, it brought in 4 million views at our festival. This year, with all the stellar lineup of authors, writers, thinkers, performances, our little festival, campus programs, I know that we will have you glued to our program. Now we're all tired of being tired, of having been locked down for so long, of having constantly to look over our shoulders and see what's coming next. But here's the thing. The only way we can beat this is by rejecting it and embracing hope instead. And hope, optimism, humankind, these are a few things that have wound themselves into our sessions this year. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy them. Keeping the tradition of having something new each year, well, this year we introduce language literature. The idea is that we acknowledge and welcome the vast knowledge and talent that exists in Indian languages. So this year it's going to be Marathi. We have a few sessions in it, and I am again sure that you're going to enjoy them. Now, despite all obstacles, we count our blessings that came in the guise of friends, well-wishers, benefactors, cultural crusaders. We are particularly blessed to have the tremendous support of Tatas. I'd like to thank Harish Bhatt, Atul Agarwal and Jaya Sapkale, who've stood by us all these years through thick and thin. I'd also like to thank our partners. Actually, they're our friends and true friends of culture and literature, who came through for us when we needed them. To them, our heartfelt thanks. Now, a festival like this can never be done alone. If it weren't for the small but super zealous team of Literature Live, we wouldn't have had this fabulous lineup that we've got lined up for you today. So, in the next 4 days, you're going to see stimulating sessions, a fair exchange of ideas, thought-provoking conversations, engaging performances, workshops, and of course, our little festival for children. So stay home this weekend, turn on all your devices, and watch literature unmasked. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Fernandez. After all, life is like a book. If you never turn the page, you'll never know what the next chapter holds. I'd now like to invite a man who's written many books, the brand custodian of Tata Sons and a veteran of many Tata companies as their director and MD, who's played a key role in building many iconic Tata brands in his day job. But he's also an author and columnist. He relishes the written word and loves spinning a good story. I'd now like to invite Mr. Harish Bhatt to say a few words, please.
Good evening and a warm welcome to all the authors, speakers and literature lovers who have joined us this evening. At the Tata Group, it is indeed our pleasure and privilege to be associated with the prestigious Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest. Ladies and gentlemen, even as we open the 12th edition of the Lit Fest today, I'd like to begin by paying a fond tribute to the late founder director of this festival and a very good friend of mine, Mr. Anil Dharker. Over the past 12 years, Anil and his team have worked relentlessly to bring together some of the world's best authors, thinkers, writers, and artists and curate a festival which meets global standards. The passion and dedication with which Anil had painstakingly nurtured this festival and made it one of the most awaited events of the year for Mumbaikars and for literature lovers everywhere is something that we fondly recall as we gather together this evening. Even the ongoing pandemic last year could not hold back his spirit. The entire festival in 2020 was held in a digital virtual format, and Anil's leadership played a major role in ensuring that that virtual event was on par with the standards set by the ground event. Anil was and will always be the guiding light for this festival. His presence will be missed, and we will all feel his absence during the course of this edition. I'm sorry to mention that we also lost another strong pillar of the festival organizing team, Mrs. Shashi Baliga, who played a key role as executive director of the festival for several years. Her ever-smiling face, wisdom, and effortless coordination will be missed by all of us. I request you to take a moment and pause to salute the memory of Anil and Shashi. And I believe that a fitting tribute to their memory and legacy will be to continue raising the bar on this Tata Literature Live Festival year after year and ensure that this show goes uninterrupted and builds from strength to strength. So my sincere congratulations, therefore, to Amy, the festival director, Quasar, and the whole festival team, which has been instrumental in putting together this year's Lit Fest. That at the Tata Group, the core purpose that drives us is a commitment to improving the quality of life of all the communities that we operate in. The last year has been extraordinarily challenging. Not just the last year, but the last 18 months have been extraordinarily challenging. And the pandemic that we have been through has been something that we have not faced for 3 generations. It has caused havoc, pain, and much transformation across our societies. The Tata Group has tried its best to contribute to the fight against the pandemic by committing more than 2,500 crores so far to various COVID relief measures. One of the ways that we also contribute to elevating the life of the community that we operate in is through our commitment to art and literature. Art and literature have always played a pivotal role in shaping the thoughts and ideas of society. But at this point in time, as we come out of the pandemic and move into a new phase in society, I think art and literature have an even more crucial role to play. Our minds have been in tumult, and I believe that art and literature will play a crucial role in elevating our minds, in understanding what has really happened, and in understanding the way forward. Therefore, this edition of the Tata Literature Festival takes even more prominence, and I hope all of you will enjoy these sessions and find them truly, I think, rejuvenating and also illuminating. The Tata Literature Festival, Tata Literature Live, happens once a year, typically in the month of November. But I would like to inform you that we have also carried on over the past year with two frequent digital versions called Tata Literature Live Business Shastras and Tata Literature Live Sports Yatras, which have brought together some of the finest names from the world of business and sports, books from the world of business and sports, and both these series have become widely popular today. So many of you may want to attend those continuing series after the Tata Literature Live Festival gets over as well. Even as I conclude this session, I want to narrate a small story from a recent book that I have authored and published called Tata Stories. And this is the story of Lady Meherbai Tata, one of the original feminist icons of India. She was the wife of Sir Dorabji Tata, the second chairman of the Tata Group, a champion of women's causes. She campaigned actively to introduce the Sarda Act, which banned child marriage in the country. She fought for the cause of women, both in India and outside India. She was a champion sportsperson who won over 60 trophies in tennis. But what is most interesting and unique is that she played all her tennis matches wearing the Parsi sari because she was so proud of her Indian and Parsi heritage. Her husband and she pledged their entire wealth, including Lady Meherbai Tata's Jubilee diamond, the sixth largest diamond in the world, to save Tata Steel from collapse. And why am I narrating this story to you? Because during this Tata Literature Live Festival, on the 21st of November, Sunday at 2:30 p.m., we would have the proud privilege to launch a graphic novel commemorating her memory, which has been developed by the Tata Group in collaboration with Amar Chitra Katha. Perhaps that's a session which none of you may want to miss because it is of great historical significance. Without further ado, I would now invite all of you to be part of this literary extravaganza. This festival continues the tradition of bringing a stellar lineup from across the world. You have more than 140 authors from across the world here, more than 70 sessions scheduled this year. I'm sure you'll find these insightful and engaging. But on behalf of the Tata Group, I would like to thank the organizing team. I would like to thank the authors, the jury members, and of course, all of you from the audience for making this literature festival such a great success. Thank you and have a wonderful Tata Literature Live.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Bhatt. As P.G. Woodhouse said, there is no surer foundation for a beautiful friendship than a mutual taste in literature. And year after year, our best friend has been the Tata Group. So once again, a huge thank you for supporting us for more than a decade. And special thanks this year to Tata Steel and Tata Projects for co-sponsoring the festival, and Godrej for powering the festival. And now onto the session that you have all been waiting for, the writer's conscience. Climate change conferences like COP26 tend to attract a lot of attention with high-sounding calls for save the planet. But the climate crisis is not just a techno-economic concern. concern, but a matter of injustice rooted in the histories of race, geopolitics, and capitalism. Pointing to such glaring gaps in our collective understanding of the climate crisis is the latest book of Amitav Ghosh, which uses the history of the nutmeg to demonstrate the need to be conscious of the Western roots of the mess we're in, the way forward, and everything in between. Amitav Ghosh always knew he would be a writer, he says, having won multiple awards for his prolific fiction and non-fiction work. His writing uses complex narratives to probe the nature of national and personal identity and the degradation of the planet. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages, and amongst his distinctions, he has been awarded 4 honorary doctorates, the Padma Shri and the Gyanpith Awards. But, he says, his most cherished moment was winning the Arthur C. Clarke Award, because he got to meet the legend himself. He has also been named one of the most important global thinkers of the world. Joining him today in conversation will be Hrishi K, the face of 94.3 Radio 1, a multiple award-winning radio host and producer with an extended career as a voiceover artist, commentator, and anchor, a much-featured podcast creator across all major streaming platforms. Please join me in welcoming Amitav Ghosh and Hrishi K. Do remember you can ask your questions in the chat box during the session, and there will be a short Q&A at the end for the last 15 minutes. So, here it is, the writer's conscience.
Thank you, Mayor, for those warm words, that wonderful introduction. Well, Jim Morrison, the frontman of the seminal band The Doors, wrote in his collection of poems, The American Prayer, "The West is the best, the West is the best, get here and we'll do the rest." Now, though his poetry skills were suspect, not so much as singing, I have to agree with his sarcastic tone as I went through Amitav's excellent parables for a planet in crisis, the nutmeg's curse, and realized that in areas of climate change and social inequity, there's really miles to go before the West can sleep, and indeed miles to go before we all can sleep. Hi, how are you holding up? I hope all vaccines have been done.
Mute myself. There we are. Yes, I'm completely vaccinated, as vaccinated as it's possible to be. And well, let me thank the festival for having me, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to you, Hrishi. I've always enjoyed our conversations very much in the past, but in the past we were always in your studio. I guess you're not in your studio right now.
Yep, it's called WFH, work from home, something
Yes.
that we are all now accustomed to. But
Yes.
Truly, thank you for that. And I have to say, yet again, you've knocked it out of the park. Such a thought-provoking book. I'm going to actually start with the year 2016 and how you went to the Banda Archipelago, Maluku. These are islands in Indonesia, the East Indies, and how you actually developed an interest in the history of that region, most of which, might I add, is a little sad, especially when you talk about the Dutch occupation of the islands and the archipelago.
Well, I've always been interested in the history of the Indian Ocean, and I've been writing about it for a very long time. So I always knew vaguely about the Spice Islands and what had happened there. But I didn't really know much about it. I didn't really know about the details. But and I always wanted to visit, Maluku, the Spice Islands, and so on. And in 2016, it was possible for me to go, so I went. And I must say, it was revelatory, just being in the Banda Islands, being in Ternate and Tidore. So I imagine most of your listeners won't know the background. But if you look around your kitchen or just around your room, I'm sure you'll see cloves, nutmeg, mace, these Jaifal and Javitri, as we call them, long is cloves. And these are so common around the world and in our households now that we just take them completely for granted. What we forget, though, is that cloves only grew on a tiny cluster of islands. in northern Maluku, really tiny islands, 5 islands, Ternate, Tidore, and 3 other islands. Yeah, and the clove tree basically didn't grow anywhere outside these islands, and Ternate and Tidore became very rich, and they were sort of like powerful empires at a certain point. And the nutmeg tree also grew on an even tinier archipelago, at the south of Maluku, in the Banda archipelago, which is really remote, and it's almost at the farthest end of Indonesia, and there's nothing anywhere close. It takes you like 8 hours in a ferry to get there. So it's these are really out of the way places. But the Banda archipelago had its own tree of life, the nutmeg tree. And the nutmeg tree again grew nowhere except this tiny cluster of volcanic islands. I mean, it's kind of magical if you think about it, But these islands, again, made Banda extremely prosperous. The Bandanese were a prosperous seafaring people. They conducted trade with people across the Indian Ocean. So that, going back, to really to the beginning of historic times, I mean, 3,000 years, nutmegs and mace were being traded in India. People in India were familiar with them. In India, in China, nutmegs were being traded in antiquity in Europe as well. But nutmegs and mace were very, very valuable commodities. Simply because they were so rare, they came from one end of the earth, and they were thought to have all these medicinal properties. And in the late medieval Europe, they became so valuable that you could buy a house or a ship, with just a handful of nutmegs. So, we all know the story of why Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, etc., set off on their voyages, and one of the intentions was to gain control of the trade in spices. And of course, our own Malabar coast was the main producer of pepper. And pepper made up the bulk of the spice trade, but pepper was not as valuable as cloves and nutmeg. So the Portuguese, soon after reaching Kerala, made their way as quickly as they could, to the Spice Islands, and they made their way, to the Bandas, to Ternate, Tidore, started building forts, etc. And the Spanish and the Portuguese fought over this spice trade. Then came the Dutch, and the Dutch were the dominant power in the 17th century. They were the dominant naval power in the world in that period. So they went to the Nutmeg Islands around about 1600, and they immediately started trying to impose a monopoly on the trade. And of course, the Bandanese resisted. They'd been trading for millennia with people all around the Indian Ocean. Why would they stop? But the Dutch insisted, and the Bandanese went on resisting. And finally, in 1621, the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, a man called Jan Pietersen Koen, he implemented a final solution. He took a fleet to the Banda Islands and basically massacred the islanders. The entire population was eliminated. I mean, thousands were killed, thousands were enslaved, and the rest died of starvation and disease. Fortunately, a few islanders were able to escape, and they've kept Bandanese traditions alive on other islands nearby. But the Bandanese were completely eliminated from these islands. And instead, then after that, the Dutch brought in Euro-descended planters, gave over all the land to them, and gave them slaves. Many of these slaves were actually from India. In fact, the majority of them were from India, perhaps. And, they went on, cultivating nutmeg. Though even then they were not very good at cultivating nutmeg, so they had to bring some Bandanese islanders back as slaves. Can you imagine the horror of it? I mean, these people, these were their islands. I mean, they've been enslaved and then they're brought back, to teach them the technology of growing nutmegs. And then, finally, of course, in the 18th century, the French and the English smuggled nutmegs out and started cultivating them all over the world, so that now nutmegs, really cost nothing and are just completely common things. So we forget, actually, what a magical and amazing thing the nutmeg tree was. But also, the strange power of this tree, that the people who had cultivated it, grown it, nurtured it, were all eliminated simply because they had this tree. So the argument of my book is really that, that the Bandanese fell victim to what you might call the resource curse. And, in a sense, what we see today with climate change is exactly that. It's the entire world has fallen victim to the resource curse.
But my firm belief is, all of you who are watching, listening, is that these conversations must translate into you picking up the book. Otherwise, there's really no point. Then it's just a conversation, some revelations and things like that. And I urge you to pick up the Nutmeg Curse, because Amitav very beautifully and passionately describes the nutmeg, which I'm not going to ask him to do here. But really, and that proves that every nutmeg has a life. And that brings me to my next question. Amitav, this historical pattern of omnicide, for centuries, the dominant powers have seen Earth, which is its plants, its animals, as mute, without agency, and, available for the taking and the killing. And that's something that you keep coming back to in the book. And I'm going to forward a little bit to when the Europeans came to North America. And, history then, in a lot of ways, repeated itself with the native Indians in North America. So talk about that. Talk about how that perception of what the earth and Mother Nature is hasn't really changed, even in the modern day and age.
Yes, I think, well, Adam Smith, who was a very clever man, said that the most important thing that ever happened in history was the discovery of the Americas and the discovery of the trade route to the Indian Ocean. And I think he was right. And this is what we see playing out today. Because in fact, what happened in the Banda Islands was completely presaged in Northern America. Because the Banda Islands were one axis of the Dutch Empire. The other axis was, in fact, where I'm sitting now, that is in New York State, Connecticut, in New England. I'm in Brooklyn, which used to be Breukelen, a Dutch village. New York was New Amsterdam. So, what happens in this period is that Europeans, especially elite Europeans, they come to America, they start these incredible massacres and genocides which unfold, in a fashion really that we don't even think about, honestly. But never in the history of the world has so much of an indigenous population been destroyed. 75 to 90% of people, of the indigenous populations of the Americas were eliminated, And at the same time, just think about it, on the one hand, they're depopulating two continents. On the other hand, they're repopulating these continents with enslaved people from Africa. And I think this whole process actually creates a mindset, a vision, a philosophy, where the earth, all the things of the earth are seen as inert, as resources that exist to serve, the masters, if you like. But remember also that it's not just the things of the earth. Most humans are also seen as inert, unable to make history, as basically just, again, just resources to be enslaved, to be transported from one place to another. It's an astonishing thing. If you think, it's not just that they think this about Africans and Asians and so on. They also think this about poor Europeans, especially about poor European women whom they set about persecuting as witches, So it's this is a period of absolutely unprecedented violence, violence against human beings. And I think it's from the violence against human beings that you get actually the launching of this incredible violence also against the things of the earth. And again, in a sense, really, the bill has now been presented by the earth itself. We are now seeing the unfolding of these catastrophic events all around us, whether it be in the Americas or across Asia. And we see certainly, and I think it's very important to remember that, in a way, climate change is always presented to us as a sort of technological and scientific kind of phenomenon, addressed by technocrats at COP26 and so on. But fundamentally, climate change is a process of violence. It's a process of violence, that's now unfolding across the earth. It's violence against the poor in the global south, but also the poor in rich countries, against racial minorities, against indigenous groups. So this is the unspeakable truth that is literally never mentioned.
Let's talk about military might. I mean, it features very prominently in the Nutmeg Scares. I mean, here it's a known fact that fossil fuels dominate our lives, Amitav. And you talk about how it's nicely swept under the carpet that any kind of military activity, buildup of armed forces, leads to great fossil fuel production, greenhouse gas emissions. And even in the calculation of our carbon footprint, it isn't taken into account. And that's something that you very pointedly say at many points in the book about how, conquests, the buildup of military, even oil tankers moving, oil across the oceans, all of this is something that we need to address more than ever before now.
Yes, absolutely. Again, as I said, I mean, for me, climate change is fundamentally a geopolitical issue, and it has to be addressed as such, So, the way that the history of fossil fuels unfolded, really, is that from the 18th century onwards, late 18th century onwards, the use of fossil fuels is actually what made Britain the dominant power in the world. And Britain handed on that baton to the United States, And today, in many ways, what we actually see is that the hegemonic power in the world is what the Anglosphere, which is Britain and its settler colonies. And their power is profoundly founded on fossil fuels. This is not just to say that on the production of fossil fuels, though of course they do produce a lot of fossil fuels. Canada, the United States is now, I think, the world's largest producer of oil. Australia is, I think, the world's largest producer of coal. And as you also know, the phenomenon of climate denial is strongest in these countries, and these countries have done the most to disrupt global climate negotiations, It has to be said, the United States, Australia, Canada, they've done everything possible to derail this process and, to break it down so that ultimately, actually, energy corporations have sent, 500 delegates, to this COP26. It's an astonishing thing. So, in essence, the power of the Anglosphere is in many ways founded upon fossil fuels. This creates I should explain that geopolitically speaking, really, fossil fuels have a very special kind of quality. They have to move in certain ways. So oil, for example, has to move through the Straits of Hormuz. The world's largest reserves of oil are in that region. So the Straits of Hormuz are a critical choke point, through which maritime power can be exerted upon all consuming countries. Similarly, the Straits of Malacca are another critical choke point, for the movement of fossil fuels. And both these choke points fundamentally are to this day controlled by the navies of the United States and Britain, Australia, and so on. And I think, it's interesting to look back on the history of these choke points because the Straits of Hormuz, the Portuguese, from the moment that they entered the Indian Ocean, understood very well the geopolitical structure of the Indian Ocean. So they went, they quickly gained control. Alfonso de Albuquerque, he gained control of the Straits of Hormuz. Shortly afterwards, they gained control of the Straits of Malacca. And for the last 500 years, basically, the European powers have controlled, the Indian Ocean and the critical choke points. But now that's shifting, simply because a major shift to renewables will also be a major geopolitical shift. If it is at all conceivable that let's say China moves on a large scale to renewable energy, it means that they won't be so dependent on oil. Actually, such a scenario is hard to foresee because, but the reason why China continues to develop its coal fields, in a sense, the reason why India continues to develop coal fields again is partly geopolitical, because the dependency on oil creates a critical vulnerability. I think these issues really have to be talked about and acknowledged, and unfortunately they are not acknowledged. So we pretend that really a shift to renewables is only about the production of energy, but renewables and fossil fuels have a very different relationship to geopolitical power, and that needs to be recognized.
True that. I'm going to come to terraforming. It's a very important part of the nutmeg's curse. And indeed, for those of you who don't know what terraforming is, in a nutshell, if I could quote an example, when the colonial settlers actually came into North America, Amitav was just referring to the area called erstwhile New England, where he is, New York City, Brooklyn. And they wanted to feel at home. And it's almost comical to say this, but they started altering the land around them to make it seem like home, with very, very drastic consequences. And I leave you to tell the story.
Well, the word terraforming, it actually came into circulation in the 1940s or 50s. It's generally a sort of it's generally used as a science fiction concept, to refer to the changing of other planets and, to the engineering of other planets to make them suitable for human beings or other species. But actually, this is exactly what especially English settlers did in North America. They completely re-engineered these landscapes, to make them look more like England. Basically, that's why where I am, it's called New England, or New York or whatever, because, they wanted it, they were thinking of Old York, if you like. But English settlers, when they first came into this region, actually found the landscape of North America extremely threatening and extremely worrisome, because a lot of these areas were just swamps. So they set about, just completely changing the land through deforestation. And what this ultimately meant is that this was also, in a sense, a process of violence, not just against the landscape, but also against Native Americans who were completely adapted to a certain kind of landscape. Their entire way of living was dependent on those landscapes. So, in effect, over the centuries, all of North America became a terraformed landscape. Similarly, Australia, you could say, to some degree, New Zealand as well. To sort of emphasize the difference, really. The British, when they, they ruled India for a very long time, but they didn't really terraform all of India in the same way. So they terraformed parts of it. Most of all, where you are in Bombay. Bombay is a completely terraformed landscape. It's an estuarine landscape, just like New York, also terraformed profoundly. But, if a time traveler from the 16th century, let's say, from central India were to come back to central India today, the landscape would not, I think, be completely unrecognizable. Whereas if that same time traveler were to come back to this region, it would be completely unrecognizable. It's a completely different ecosystem, because also they used livestock in ways that transformed this ecosystem. But what we see today actually is that these terraformed landscapes are actually now responding in completely unpredictable ways. So California, for example, which is one of the most terraformed parts of the United States, is now simply sort of coming undone. It's bursting into these terrible wildfires. There are these incredible droughts. The wildfires have become so bad, along the American West Coast, that many people are actually leaving. One constantly meets, refugees from that region because they simply can't breathe the air anymore. So I think it's one of the weird ways in which climate change is manifesting itself. So that we now begin to see that, in fact, the indigenous ways of living on these lands were incredibly wise, actually. They understood the landscape in a profound sense. And they constantly, told English settlers that, you just don't understand this land. You don't know how to live on this land. And of course, the settlers just, suppressed them with incredible violence.
I'm going to come to another abiding theme of the Nutmeg Scarce Parables for a Planet in Crisis. Amitav, you talk about migration, the heart-wrenching scenes of what we went through in India, with laborers actually walking back home, and then in the case of Bengalis, of going back and having to contend with a cyclone, and how, and I'm going to leave you to complete this, one would think that the migration crisis in Europe or the Mediterranean is something that is very exclusively confined to people of that region and terrain. But you actually traveled to Italy and you met a boy who's a refugee, a migrant because of climate change, and he was Bangladeshi. So I leave you to tell that parable, that story.
Yes, a lot of my book is actually about migration, and I became interested in the subject, well, because I'm myself, someone who's moved a lot between countries and so on. But around about 2014, 2015, at the height of the European migration crisis, I began to notice something that nobody was talking about. But you could see it quite clearly on film footage and also in photographs of the migrants who were crossing the Mediterranean in those rickety old boats and things. I could tell that these were Bengalis, because Bengalis look distinctive in some ways, and I can certainly recognize them. And I became very curious, and then I started looking at all the statistics, and in fact, at many points in time during the crisis, actually to this day, Bangladeshis are the second highest number of migrants arriving in southern Europe. So I became very curious about this, and I went to Italy in 2016, 2017, and traveled to many of the refugee camps and migration centers, and interviewed many Bangladeshis, and also there were many Pakistanis in these camps, and I interviewed many Pakistanis as well. It was very interesting. There are very few Indians actually. And the few Indians that there are usually Punjabis, who also have networks of migration and are accustomed to migrating. But I think this will also become a phenomenon in India. The reason why Bangladeshis and Pakistanis are able to leave is because migration networks exist, very powerful sort of chains of Dalali, as they are called, and those are the chains that move people. Those chains aren't as ubiquitous in India yet, but I suspect that they will become, because we know that there's a huge agricultural crisis in northern India, in central India. But for now, people are adjusting to the climate crisis in India really by moving internally within India. And I've seen this so clearly, in Goa, where I have a house. But over the last 10 or 15 years, really the entire working class of Goa has become a migrant working class, people coming from Bengal, from Jharkhand, from Odisha. It's an astonishing thing. I mean, on the streets of the village where I have my house in Goa, now you can hear Bangla being spoken all the time. I mean, the little restaurants that serve you Goan food are actually run by Bengalis. And so, but these are not permanent migrants. They are cyclical migrants. What they do is circular migration. So they spend a little time in Goa, then they go back home, then they come again. That's why they don't want to settle, really, because they want to go back to their families. And this is the population that was worst affected by the lockdown in India. Suddenly they found themselves stranded, having to live in a place where they only wanted usually just spend a few months. That was what created this crisis. And it's astonishing that the government enacted the lockdown without making any provision for these people. It was in effect a kind of class war.
You also talk about epidemics, and very relevantly so, because of what we're going through. We're in the throes, at least coming out in a lot of ways, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is a portion that really struck a chord where you talk about the Civil War in America, and staggeringly disproportionate numbers of Native and African Americans who were dying of epidemics, and the mortality rate was uniformly double that of the whites, and in many cases 3 or 4 times as large. And we saw history repeat itself during the COVID-19 pandemic, where again, there were states and regions in the US where you saw that play out as far as African Americans and Native Indians are concerned. Talk to me about that.
Yes, it was an astonishing thing. These statistics started coming out, I think it was in 2020, in July or August. It became clear that minority populations were being massively disproportionately affected. For example, the Latino workers in meatpacking plants, suffered incredibly. A lot of minority populations, black populations, indigenous people, were dying in enormous numbers. But the extraordinary thing was that the public response in America, when these disparities came to be known, was that they began to want to open up. Instead of protecting these populations, what they wanted to do was to expose them more. And this is actually the dynamic that is also behind climate change. The affluent, or those who feel themselves to be protected in some way, are not concerned about, protecting vulnerable people. They just want to exploit their vulnerabilities. It's a horrifying thing.
True that. Okay, I think we're going to have to go into our Q&A. Thank you very much, all of you who have been proactive and have sent in some questions. So I'm going to pick out a few. This is Anita Limaye, and she asks, Amitav, the mechanistic understanding of the environment may have developed in Europe, but doesn't the speed at which it was accepted by non-white elites around the world suggest it had intrinsic universal appeal?
I don't believe that to be the case. And it hasn't been, it wasn't adopted with any kind of speed. We just need to think of Mahatma Gandhi, who was the most influential politician really in India of the 20th century. He was incredibly resistant, to these mechanistic understandings of the earth and of the world. Indeed, I would even say that to this day, the great majority of Indians don't subscribe to these mechanistic understandings. The people who live in farms, the farmers, the Adivasis, across India, they continue to resist these mechanistic understandings. But of course, middle class and elite Indians have completely adopted, these approaches. But that again has happened literally over the last 30 or 40 years. That is since 1990. Since the Washington Consensus. And fundamentally, the Washington Consensus is really at the end of the day, what we call neoliberal economics or whatever, is actually a sort of, how shall I say, a sort of formalization of what you might call a settler colonial economy. The idea that the earth can just be constantly looted and it will always provide like some sort of cornucopia. And we now know that that understanding is not viable. But you're absolutely right that elite Indians and middle-class Indians have become completely captive to what you might call, settler colonial vision of the earth.
While billionaires try and colonize Mars, that's also a part of Amitav's book, and ironical. But another reason to pick up the nutmeg skirts. This is Anand Lele, I imagine somebody from Mumbai City. Amitav, reports from COP26 at Glasgow suggest we won't meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target for 2030. How concerned should coastal cities like Mumbai be?
Coastal cities like Mumbai particularly should be very, very concerned. In my book, The Great Derangement, I write about all the climate hazards that Mumbai faces. And in 2016, when my book was published, and I say there that large parts of Mumbai are going to be underwater, within certainly the lifetimes of many Mumbaikars, possibly in the next 15, 20 years. When I said this back then, people thought I was, exaggerating, saying something absurd and so on. But now, I think it was a municipal commissioner or someone in Mumbai who actually said by 2050, large parts of Mumbai are going to be underwater. And anyone, who has any kind of common sense can see that this is going to be the case. Mumbai is built on vast tracts of so-called reclaimed land at a time when especially British engineers believed that they could completely control nature, just like they could control colonized peoples. So they went ahead and did all this terraforming around Mumbai. But now we see that in fact, the sea is reclaiming its own. The sea is taking back, what it lost. And the results are going to be cataclysmic, absolutely cataclysmic for Mumbai. Though there's one sort of piece of silver lining, if you like, which is that Mumbai has Navi Mumbai, which was designed really by my dear friend, the late Charles Correa, who had incredible foresight. And I think anyone in Mumbai who's concerned about climate risks has this option. They can move to Navi Mumbai.
Yeah, actually nicely segues into our next one. This is from Anurag. Thank you for writing in. Amitav, you associate the concept of terraforming with Western colonization. But wasn't the burning of the Khandava forest in the Mahabharata also an act of terraforming, slash and burn cultivation on an ecologically destructive scale?
The reason why what happened in the Americas is terraforming is not just because they had, fires and so on. I mean, of course, human beings have altered and also adapted to landscapes from time immemorial, The reason why it's terraforming in the case of the Americas and Australia is because the landscapes are re-engineered to look like another continent. In effect, to suit the lifestyles of people from another continent. So they're terraformed with the idea of making these landscapes resemble England and Europe. The burning of forests in ancient India didn't happen with that in mind, with another model in mind. If they had done it with another model in mind, then that would have been the case, but they didn't.
This is Deeksha. Amitav, what and where do you think is the weakest link that will trigger the first collapse in the world because of issues of climate change?
We're already seeing effectively collapse, in many places. We should make no mistake about it. We may not talk about the climate crisis or any of these other crises as being omnipresent in our lives, but they are, and the sort of political instability you see, unfolding around the planet, they're completely related to this. Who would have thought, 20 years ago that a country that has been so incredibly stable for centuries, like the UK, the United Kingdom, would suddenly, just lurch from one crazy position to another, you know. So I think this process of unraveling is already happening around us in many, many ways, and I think it's only going to accelerate. I'm sorry to sound so gloom and doomy, because I know a lot of the people who are listening to this are probably young people. But it's impossible to be Pollyanna-ish at this time. We are moving towards a completely disrupted future, and the pandemic is just one sign of that. And we should not fool ourselves that we can go back to some sort of normal. That normal is gone.
Elena Lobo, Amitav, do you think there is a balanced integration of social sciences and natural sciences, which can indeed combine to provide solutions to current global problems?
Well, it's something that one would hope for. But in fact, I really can't say that the empirical evidence bears witness to this. I mean, what have the natural science and social sciences done in relation to this contemporary, in relation to climate change, for example? I mean, they've identified some problems, yes, of course, but have they helped to move us towards any kind of solutions? I just don't see that that's the case.
We're going to squeeze in one last one. This is Kriti Kulkarni. How genuinely is it possible for poor countries to adopt climate change mitigating policies which might have a negative impact on their growth and their development?
I think it's very important to think of the idea of to think about climate justice, and certainly the poorest people in India or in Africa, Indonesia, wherever, should be given more access to energy. The energy has many vital uses in their lives, and we can't think of depriving them of energy. But unfortunately, when this argument about poorer countries in relation to other countries is made, it's almost always made with the interests of the middle classes and wealthy classes in mind. I mean, the sort of growth that we are seeing in India, who does it benefit? The benefits go almost entirely, to certain dominant groups. And when dominant groups make this argument about, our carbon footprint in relation to the carbon footprints of the West, I'm sorry, but often these arguments are made in bad faith, because they're not really ultimately concerned with the carbon usage of Adivasis or farmers or whatever. They really just want to keep on expanding their own carbon footprints. So, there's a lot of, these are complicated issues. Of course, we have to think about justice in relation to the needs of the poor, But we also have to think of, curbing the carbon usage of middle class and wealthy people. I mean, one thing that I've seen over the last 10, 15 years, is that middle class families now, not even affluent, but middle class families, just continuously accumulate vehicles. They'll have 2 cars, 3 cars, also a scooter, also a motorcycle. It's just accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and that's a pattern that that we can see expanding around the globe. I mean, in America today, you go to certain suburbs, and that's exactly that. Each house has like 4 or 5 cars. So, it's like people used to change dresses or clothes, and so, today I feel like wearing this. So, the same way, that's how they treat cars,
Well, I have to say this, Amitav. The Nutmeg's Curse Parables for a Planet in Crisis is really such a worthy successor to The Great Derangement. I was hoping we could do a twin session on Jungle Nama for all of you who are fans of Amitav's writing, and I truly am. Jungle Nama is also out, so you should also try and get a load of that too. This has been fascinating, as it always is with you, and thank you very much for your time and your patience.
Thank you, Hrishi. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me at this festival. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for that engaging and eye-opening exchange, Mr. Ghosh and Hrishi K. Yes, the future doesn't look promising, but let's all try our best to make a difference, one nutmeg at a time. That concludes our very first For the Love of the Word, the Anil Dharker session at Tata Literature Live 2021. Remember to log into our debate at 1915 hours IST. College students should not participate in political protests chaired by Raghav Behel. You can buy the books we spoke about in this session from our knowledge partner, landmarkxcite.com. That's landmarkxcite.com. Thanks to our title sponsor Tata and co-sponsors Tata Steel and Tata Projects, powered by Godrej. The festival's social media handle is @TataLitLive across all platforms. Hope you can join us over the next 3 days for all the sessions we've lined up, making sure this festival can be realized even in its digital version, where you can stay safe at home and enjoy literature unmasked. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural For the Love of the Word, the Anil Dharker session at Tata Literature Live 2021. Happy reading.